Julian Barnett of London giving you a great tip as to how to explore this city. And that tip is to work on the principle of devising circular tours. Circular tours, it speaks for itself. You start and you end in the same place and you build in a whole lot of things in that actual route and plan it really quite precisely so you grab as much stuff as you can in a relatively limited period of time. So for today, this is our starting place. Our starting place is Gordon Square, Bloomsbury. In fact, to be precise, right outside the Church of Christ the King. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to do approximately a 30 to 40 minute tour of Bloomsbury, taking in 10 architectural styles within that period of time. So the theme of today is architecture in Bloomsbury. Why have I chosen architecture in Bloomsbury? Because in a way, Bloomsbury is your absolutely typical London neighbourhood. It's an old neighbourhood, founded way back in the 11th century when this whole area was fields, and it was lands given by William the Conqueror, who took England in 1066, and gave these lands to one of his French barons, which is where the word Bloomsbury comes from. So I'm then going to take us all the way from this spot through to 10 different architectural styles: Roman, Saxon, Norman, Jacobean, or even before Jacobean, early medieval, late medieval, Elizabethan, Stuart, Jacobean, then all the way through to the Georgians and the Victorians and Art Nouveau, and then arts and crafts, Art Deco, all the way through to 1960s brutalist architecture, and even a little bit further to a really remarkable little building built at the turn of the 21st century. That, in a way, is typical of London because it's a complete patchwork of architectural styles that are just somehow held together. So here we go, 10 styles in about 40 minutes, starting and ending at the same spot. Bloomsbury, London. Off we go. Site 1, St George's Gardens. Now, this is a very ancient place. It is top of our list of the oldest places that I'm going to take you to today. When you look at it, it looks like your average Victorian gardens and cemetery, but there's a much, much longer history. Because although what you're looking at here is a Victorian, Georgian sort of area, it was built upon an Elizabethan area, which in itself was built upon an early medieval area, which in itself was built upon a Norman area, which in itself was built upon a Saxon area. So this is layer upon layer upon layer. But the story is even more ancient, because in fact, beneath those Saxon remains, there have been some pieces of Roman pottery and Roman stonework found. Remember that this whole area where I am, Bloomsbury, was once fields outside the centre of London, but the actual place of settlement has been here for a long time. Now, of course, it's central London, it's enveloped by the city, and Bloomsbury is part of Camden, the borough of Camden itself, one of the 32 boroughs of London. But the actual place itself has been a place of continued human habitation for at least 2,000 years. So what you're looking at now, lovely garden, nicely landscaped, few gravestones around, is the, I suppose, the top layer of 2,000 years of history. But there's one particular reason why I've brought you here, and that is in the far eastern end of St George's Gardens. And that's what I'm going to take you to now. Follow me. And we're almost here. Follow me through this little collection of gravestones, and I'm going to take you to a very important grave, but in almost typical London fashion, nobody really knows about it. There it is, and you can see right on the stone is the name Anna, 6th daughter of Richard Cromwell, the Protector, 2nd wife of Thomas Gibson, born at Hursley, Hampshire, 27th of March 1659, died in London 7th of December 1727. This is the granddaughter of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was, of course, Lord Protector of England 1649 to 1660, after Charles I had been executed, the only period in English history when England has been a republic. After his 11 years, Oliver Cromwell was nearing death, and he actually wanted to pass on the ruling of England to his son Richard. Richard was not as competent as his father. Richard had 6 daughters, and one of them was Anna. And there was some talk of Anna, in fact, becoming Lady Protector of England once her grandfather Oliver died. Well, it never happened. Richard took over, wasn't in power for long, and then of course there's the period of the Restoration. But it's so interesting that here it is, in this corner of London, in quite an obscure little cemetery that hardly anybody comes to. And here is the grave of a lady that could have been ruler of this country at one stage. It's in a bit of a poor state of disrepair, but it's all there, and most importantly, her remains are there. And in a way, it crowns what this cemetery is, because like any cemetery, particularly in large towns like London, any cemetery that you see is in fact just the top layer of many, many generations of those that have been buried in that cemetery. Because the population of London was growing so much over so many centuries, what was happening was you'd have burials, then topsoil, then another layer of burials, then topsoil. By the time we get to the late 18th century, there was such a problem with cemeteries quite literally being stacked so full of bodies that whenever there were floods in London, of which there were many, we have many accounts of the remains of those bodies just tumbling out into the streets. Thus the decision in the 19th century to build a whole group of satellite cemeteries around what was then the edge of London. Kensal Green, Nunhead, Highgate, Newington Green and so on, Abney Cemetery, etc. The idea being that huge cemeteries will be built around London. The ancient cemeteries such as this one will be emptied, literally, of hundreds of thousands of bodily remains, and those remains will be reinterred in the new cemeteries. So it's actually not particularly common to find a cemetery like this which is undisturbed on its original plan, and this is just one of them. And that, I suppose, is why I chose this particular place for our first place of era, this tour of eras around Bloomsbury, because the cemetery, although it appears to be 18th, 19th century, is really built upon those many, many layers of London. Now we'll move on to Site 2. Site 2. Thomas Coram, Coram's Fields, the Foundling Hospital. What is a foundling? A foundling is an abandoned infant, and this was a huge problem in 17th century England, where many unmarried mothers were getting pregnant and giving birth with all the stigma that was attached to that. Additionally, not just the stigma, but all the economic hardship of not being able to bring up a child in normal circumstances because the child was born out of wedlock. How did mothers in that situation cope with this situation? Well, sometimes they would just abandon their children. They would just literally throw them out. Sometimes they lived with the child and they brought the child up, but this was a very, very difficult life. And then the philanthropist, Thomas Coram, had the most remarkable idea. He would give money to set up what was called the Foundlings Hospital, an institution that would take in, no questions asked, children from such situations. And the poignancy, the tragedy, is that where I'm standing was a point of extreme sadness for hundreds, if not thousands of ladies, because I'm standing in an alcove, and this alcove is where ladies would come in the dead of night, under cover of darkness. They would bring their newborn babies to this spot where there were bars originally, where these holes are, and they would literally put their child over the bars into this space and leave them bye-bye to their infant for the rest of their lives, with the knowledge that at dawn every morning workers would come from the hospital just a few hundred yards away, pick up the children that were here and take them in, and at least give them a chance. Now, it should be added that a lot of those children would have died from exposure. They might have even died from being crushed, because sometimes we know from the records of the time there were piles of children placed here once it got around that this was the chance to save those children. But that was life in that time, and it's part of the history of this city. And this institution, this remarkable institution of the Foundling Hospital, continues to this day. It is no longer a hospital for foundlings, it's no longer a hospital for children that don't have their mothers anymore, but it is still a place that is dedicated for the interests of children. The huge grounds that Thomas Coram left in his trust still survive, and they are still dedicated to young people. And just to make the point, excuse me, Sarah, just to thank you very much, just to make the point, look at the wording of the actual sign here, which is straight out of Thomas Coram's trust. Coram's Fields is not a public park, and adults may only enter if accompanied by a child. It's the inversion of the normal sentence, which reflects the tradition of this place and reflects the very, very poignant memories of what and circumstances of what brought about this place. 17th century Bloomsbury. Site 3, an absolute classic sweep of a late Georgian Regency period terrace of houses. There are literally thousands and thousands of these all around London. And what is remarkable about them is their unremarkability. They are still going, they're still pretty normal. Most people don't bat an eyelid at them, but they are incredible survivors. These would have been built for your middle classes when they were actually put up there, and they have served their time and they've done really, really well. This is just round the corner from Site 2 that we went to, Coram's Fields, and London has absolutely loads of streets like this, often turned into hotels, sometimes bedsits, all types of housing. There's a beauty to them, there's a simplicity. They were put up pretty cheaply, as you can see. Just first, second, third, fourth floor, you've got your roof there, probably a cellar, and that was that. They were put up in a short period of time, but they were dead useful. Now I'm going to cross to the other side, because there's something particularly interesting about this house that I couldn't resist showing you. Follow me. How about this for something amazing? A blue plaque. We're going to have a whole session or sessions on blue plaques in due course. But just look at this. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1870 to 1924, founder of the USSR, lived here in 1908. Now, I'll be telling the whole story of how Lenin ended up living in this area, and that's an interesting story in itself. But the fact that you have here, people are passing, they don't even realise. One of the formative personalities, love him or hate him, of the 20th century, lived here in 1908 on one of these houses. You know, these houses have seen people come and go through the generations. But what an amazing thing that Lenin actually lived here. I've actually been inside this house, and some of the original door handles that Lenin would have used, the original fireplaces that Lenin would have sat around on freezing evenings because he had very little money to pay his rent, and in fact he was thrown out of this place because he didn't pay his rent eventually. Those very things that he would have seen and used, some of those items are still in there. But that's for another tale. Site number 4. Yep, it's another London classic, your local pub. And there it is, Victorian, late 19th century. The tiles on it are perhaps an Edwardian addition, but this institution of this particular pub, the Boot, has been here since the 1890, a dead local place. It has local singing 3 nights a week. I can strongly recommend it. But it's absolutely, once again, of its type and loyal to what it was designed to do and doing what it always did well. Bringing the locals in, bringing people together, a real community centre. If you come down here to the side, you will see what lots of pubs often had, these side alleys where people would sit, where locals would sit, sometimes to do their washing, sometimes their cleaning, because remember we're talking about the 1890s where people didn't have those facilities at home. It's even got the original flagstones from when all that was put down a century and a bit ago. And then it carries on back down to what would have been a shared alleyway, where there would have been terraces on either side and people would have lived the old traditional community life. It's a classic, it's still going strong, and there it is, the Boot. Site number 5. This is an unusual one. This is Mary Ward House, built in the arts and crafts style. Now, the arts and crafts movement ran for a relatively short period of time in this country. Its most lengthy estimates are 1880 to 1920, but in effect, the real architectural manifestation of the arts and crafts movement was only for about 15 years, from around about 1895 to about 1910. By 1915, 1918, it was really out of fashion, and many of the arts and crafts buildings were demolished. So this is a rare survivor. Mary Ward House, named after Mary Ward, is a very interesting place. Mary Ward was a social campaigner, social reformer. She was a novelist, a philanthropist, and she built this building to be, in effect, a community centre. There were classrooms in it for the poor. There were workrooms in it for the elderly. There was even rooms there. She was well ahead of her time. Think about this, 110 years ago. She even put rooms there so that disabled people could earn a living by learning a craft. But she was a mixed bag, because Mary Ward also was one of the founders of the women's anti-national suffrage movement. She campaigned against the women's right to vote. So she's a bit of a quirky one, very reformist and very forward-looking in some ways and quite reactionary in others. The arts and crafts movement was heavily politicised, was involved in pamphleteering, was involved in social reforming. It was also very, very much committed to bringing in arts and crafts from all over the world, Japanese, Chinese, Orientalist influences and so on. And when you look at that building, you can see it's a strange sort of hodgepodge of buildings, of styles, of brickwork and so on. If ever you come across an arts and crafts building anywhere, do explore it. They're few and far between and quite beautiful in their own way. Number 6, Russell Square Tube Station. It is a beauty of a tube station, and it's built in that terracotta stone. 1906 is the date, so Edwardian period. And as you can see, it has that wonderful enamelling on the front with the famous roundel of the London Underground network on it. Look also up, high up, because you can see that the tube station was literally carved out of a Regency period terrace. So you can see how the terrace has just been cut on one side. Now look at the other, cut on the other side, and the tube station inserted within it. It is a classic of its type, but one thing in it I can't show today, but it's for a future time, is the staircase within it. Because within Russell Square Tube Station is what I've always felt is the most beautiful tube station in the London Underground network. All duck egg blue and terracotta and wine coloured tiles. But that's a little tease, that's for another time. But it's a great one. Number 6, the Edwardian period, Russell Square Tube Station. Site number 7. An Art Deco wonder. What is Art Deco? It comes from the Art Deco Fair, the Exposition Internationale Art Décoratif, which was in Paris, 1925. And it absolutely led to this explosion of wonderful, wonderful creativity, which was a reaction against the fussiness of the Victorian and Edwardian periods. So what you have in Deco buildings is simple lines, straight lines, simplicity itself, a tremendous sense of style, lines everywhere, up and down, horizontal and vertical. And if you really look at that building and you squint your eyes, it actually begins to look a little bit like an ocean liner. Because of course the 1920s and 30s were the great periods of sailing across the seas, of luxury liners and so on. And Deco buildings really do have that slickness, that feel. And you can really get that idea. Look at the details of the building. They almost look like the waves of waves in certain parts. This building was built for a company of architects, and there are still architects' offices within it to this day. And it is a real deco classic of its time and an absolute beauty. Won awards then, wins awards now, and now has grade 1 listing because it's a particularly rare and admired piece. Number 8. This is Bramber House. Bramber House was built in the 1950s. It is absolutely of its time, and it is a place that was put up pretty fast and pretty cheaply in order to deal with the problem in London that followed the Second World War. Remember, London had suffered from a huge amount of bombing during the war, the Blitz, and there was an enormous housing shortage in that decade following the war. So by the time we get to the early 1950s, the authorities really have to get to grips with this and put up some form of permanent housing very quickly. What do? They build buildings like this, and loads of them in this area. Why this area? Because of course the Germans were aiming for this particular area because of all the stations. Just behind here is King's Cross St Pancras stations. King's Cross Station, St Pancras Station. Beyond there is Euston Station. Beyond that is Marylebone Station. Beyond that, even a bit further, but off the Euston Road, is Paddington. So this was a whole area where there was major campaigns of bombings to knock out the many stations that are dotted along this part of London's Euston and Marylebone roads. So Bramber House was put up, many of dozens of other types were. 1950s, straight up there, simple stuff, put up there, effective for people to live in, and it stands and serves its purpose to this day. Number 9, site number 9, the Brunswick Centre. Built 1967 to 72, the brave new world of so-called brutalist architecture, when London was reinventing itself and where lots of these such buildings are being put up to try to bring people back into the centre of London. It was built as supposedly really fine quality architecture, but it never took off. And by the time we get to the mid-70s, it is a pretty crime-riven place. Nobody wanted to be here. Now, of course, it's taking off again, and everybody wants to try to get to live here. Just look at the dimensions of the place. This remarkable ziggurat almost design of these steps going up, designed to have shops and garages below, accommodation above. It's an absolute classic of its type, now highly desirable, and often associated with dystopian future and all types of modernist, brutalist forms of architecture, but of its type as, once again, a classic, and one that's certainly worth a visit, the Brunswick Centre. Site number 10. This is a wonderful place. Built just 9 years ago in 2011, this is the United Reformed Church of Bloomsbury, and it in fact won an award by RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. It's a very beautiful place. If you look down, you'll see that this is the modernist font where baptisms would take place. But now the glory of the place. Look up. It is literally a funnel within a building, and that funnel opens up at the very top to the skies. So when church services occur, the actual Eucharist, the Mass, occurs within this little chapel, bringing in the light from above down to the place of prayer, the lectern here. It's a very beautiful concept, and I suppose what really fascinated me was the fact that it just made the point that this area of Bloomsbury, all the way back from the first place we went to, of Roman settlement, going all the way through to 2011, is an area that is, architecturally speaking, reinventing itself all the time. And now let me walk you to the outside of the building. So we come out from the main chapel of the church and we come into the communal area, a lovely bright communal area with a soaring ceiling, and now you can see how this chapel area is in fact built within the actual church structure itself. It's a really novel idea. And then it comes through here, and again that feeling of airiness of light. The whole external wall of the church is glass, facing out to the street, welcoming everybody. It's a wonderful way to end this tour because I suppose this openness of window represents what Bloomsbury has always been about. Openness to change, openness to different peoples, to waves of architectural styles coming in. So there you are. Within 10 minutes of our original starting point, we've done a sweep of 10 different architectural styles, 10 different eras in the life of this area. This area, just one little part of London. We've gone from Roman London to Saxon London to Norman London. We've been through Georgian London and Regency London, and of course onwards to Victorian and Edwardian and arts and crafts and deco and 1950s and so on. This is typical of London because it's all on your doorstep. It's a city that's been going for the better part of 2,000 years. So wherever you are in London, you can come across a terrific sweep of whatever you're looking for within a few steps of your doorstep. There's one final thing I'd like to point out, and it is a note of caution. We started here and we're ending here. And here you can see one architectural style that I mentioned that I have not yet mentioned in full, and that is Gothic. A real Gothic looking church with rose window, with a central nave, with soaring transepts and so on. But nothing is as it seems, because although this is a Gothic style, it is in fact nothing of the sort. It was in fact built in 1851. It's only a century and a half old, but it was built in the Gothic revival style rather than true Gothic itself. So beware, a note of caution. You might be in London and you might think, oh, this is this and this is that. You might need to look twice at that and really examine it yourself. But this gives a taste of the richness and the diversity of London and the layered and nuanced way that the city has evolved over time, because, as I've mentioned before, this is a city that has never really been planned, that has never really been mapped out by a great planner. It has just evolved, it's muddled through, and that is part of the glory of London. Thank you.